Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us. My name is Katie Rowley. I am the Outreach Librarian for the NOAA Central Library, and we are happy to host today's seminar, an assessment of coastal resilience in Great Lakes communities, basin-wide resources, and local efforts in response to a changing coastline. This is a quick logistical announcement. You are muted, so you cannot unmute yourself. You can't verbally ask questions, but you have a question or chat panel that you can add questions to and ask those. We will ask all questions at the end of the seminar. Also, this is being recorded, so if you have to step away for any reason or if you would like to share this with a colleague, the NOAA Central Library will have it up on our YouTube channel shortly after we end. Also, if you are putting in a question, those questions will be recorded. They will be shared with our presenters after the fact for follow-up, but we do not keep your information after that. Okay, I'm going to turn it over to Rebecca Nicodemus, who is going to introduce our speakers today.
Hi, everyone. Thank you for coming to this webinar. So my name is Becky Nicodemus, and I am on the Great Lakes team in NOAA's Office for Coastal Management. So our office and the Great Lakes and St. Lawrence Cities Initiative were the clients for the research you'll hear about today. The Cities Initiative is a binational coalition of Great Lakes mayors that are interested in protecting and restoring this wonderful basin. So you'll hear more context for this research from the presenters, but I wanted to say a few words, particularly for those that are less familiar with the Great Lakes. So the water levels of the 5 Great Lakes are influenced by a number of factors, including precipitation and evaporation, and these factors are influenced differently by our changing climate. The Great Lakes naturally fluctuate, but these fluctuations have become more pronounced over time. So for example, the Great Lakes Basin saw its wettest 60-month period in 120 years of record keeping, ending in August of 2019. So this resulted in high lake levels across the basin, with record high levels for Lake Erie and Ontario, causing flooding, erosion, and other issues. And this came just after the longest period of low water levels recorded in history for the Upper Great Lakes between 1999 and 2014. So taking Lake Michigan-Huron as an example, the lake hit historic low water levels in January of 2013, and then it rose 6 feet in 6 years to nearly its record high. So these extreme lows and highs impact coastal communities and the natural environment, and they are predicted to continue to be more extreme in the future: higher highs, lower lows, and faster switches in between. But there are proactive actions that can be taken, from policies and ordinances to conservation and restoration to nature-based approaches. And we wanted, as an office, to gain a better insight at the municipal scale of what actions were being taken and what barriers remained to building resilience to these challenges. And that's where this project came in. So we had a fantastic 6-person master student team that worked wonderfully together for 16 months on this research. And you'll be hearing from 2 of them today. So on behalf of NOAA OCM, the Cities Initiative, I'd like to thank the student team, the University of Michigan School of Environment and Sustainability, and Professor Paul Steelback for their collaboration on this project. And I'd also like to thank NOAA Central Library for hosting this webinar. And with that, I'll pass it off to Annika and Anna. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Becky and Katie, for introducing us. Hello, everyone. I'm Annika Tomson. I'm here today with my team member, Anna Kaczmarek, to present our research and assessment of coastal resilience in Great Lakes communities, basin-wide resources, and local efforts in response to a changing coastline. As Becky said, this was completed as part of a capstone project for the University of Michigan School for Environment and Sustainability. Anna and I are part of a team of 6. Our fellow team members are Andrea Payne, Hannah Paulson, Elsa Soderberg, and Kat Cameron, and we worked with our advisor, Paul Seablock, and our 2 client organizations, the Great Lakes and St. Lawrence Cities Initiative and NOAA's Office for Coastal Management on this project. And thank you to NOAA Central Libraries for having us today. We're really excited to be here and to share what we've been doing for 16 months. Next slide. So just a bit of an outline of what we'll be talking about today. We're going to cover the background of the project, the context in which it's developed, and why it's important, especially in this moment. Then Anna is going to dive into the 3 different libraries that we've produced, the resource library and the funding library, and the results and takeaways from those. I will then dive into the interviews that we conducted and some findings from those as well. Then finally, Anna will finish off with takeaways from both methods of data collection and recommendations that we have developed. Next slide. So, as the largest freshwater system in the world, the Great Lakes and St. Lawrence River watershed is an essential resource that drives the cultural, ecological, and economic well-being of central Canada and the Midwestern United States. The Great Lakes are the lifeblood of the region and support nearly 40 million people. They hold a fifth of the available fresh water in the world. And we utilize the Great Lakes for their many resources, excuse me, as they support a variety of industries like manufacturing, agriculture, and mining, rely on the basin's waters for shipping and transport, irrigation, and hydropower, but also recreation and tourism are vital to many of our community's economies. However, climate change is affecting the lakes more and more. The increase in storm intensity and frequency has caused flooding and has damaged infrastructure, and climate change has the potential to greatly stress coastal communities and their budgets as they become stretched to meet the staggering costs of repairing inadequate and damaged coastal infrastructure. Next slide. So why are we doing this research now? So as Becky already touched on, so following the low water levels in 2013 and 2014, the Great Lakes region experienced high precipitation and river inflow, leading to record high water levels between 2017 and 2020. And these high water levels have led to coastal flooding and erosion, which has damaged critical coastal infrastructure, disrupt shipping and recreational use of the lakes, and has also damaged private property, as you can see here from this iconic photo. Next slide. So out of this very stressful 3-year period, there is a great deal of attention and interest in tackling these issues now. Political interest is peaking, as well as responses and resources from agencies around the basin. And as this is a window, there's a possibility that eventually this window will close. So we want to take advantage of that. There's a high degree of urgency. Private landowners want to protect their homes and their properties. Municipalities also want to protect infrastructure and public space along the shoreline. And the waters fluctuate. We don't know what future water cycles will look like, so it's important to act as before the water fluctuates again. Finally, resources. There's a lot of people producing informational and funding resources right now. Capacity building organizations are creating toolkits, holding webinars, and creating lots of different silos of information. And specific funding resources have been generated in response to this high water cycle. For example, the Coastal Lakeshore Economy and Resiliency Initiative, or the CLEAR initiative, was in New York State, was initiated because of these high water events. Next slide. So climate change will continue to create issues regarding coastal resiliency, combined with the issues we just talked about. And that is where we come in. As one of our interviewees said, if we don't understand it, we avoid it, we don't confront it. And when we do have to confront it is when we have disaster. So these are challenges from the 2017-2020 high water cycle. The first is coordination. There's a lot of excitement that's pushing everyone to get to work. Everyone wants to make an impact. However, that means sometimes due to lack of communication, agencies and municipalities are doing the same work. Municipalities are doing projects that could possibly cancel each other out. And by virtue of scale, coordination is incredibly difficult, but by virtue of the interconnected ecosystems and social networks, coordination is necessary. As I said before, this is a moment of opportunity. This is a window. There's a limited amount of time before that these issues will capture politicians and residents' interests before they are no longer interested in putting time or tax dollars to it. Finally, equity. There's already a uneven and inequitable distribution of planning and resources around the basin, and the urgency and disjointed nature of coastal resilience work can mean that equity is put to the side or simply not considered. And this project arose from this opportunity window. So to assess these challenges and to aid in navigating them. Next slide. So to do that, we created 3 project objectives. The first, Objective 1, to compile and assess existing coastal resiliency information, resources, and funding opportunities. Objective 2, to identify enabling and constraining factors of local coastal resilience work in the Great Lakes and St. Lawrence Basin, and to further understand and identify how equity is addressed in existing coastal resilience work. And our third and final objective is to make recommendations to local governments and Great Lakes practitioners for how to effectively and collaboratively advance future coastal work. Now I'm going to hand it off to Anna.
Yeah, so I'm going to be talking first about our resource library and the analysis we did on it. This is going towards our Objective 1, which again is to compile and assess coastal resiliency informational resources and funding. And the goal was to understand the ecosystem of current resources available on coastal resilience to support local action, and to identify gaps and needs to inform future resource development. The outcome of this was that we developed a library of informational, educational, and data resources relating to climate adaptation, flood mitigation, and coastal resilience. We compiled any informational resources that support municipalities' work on coastal resilience, and we hoped it would be a one-stop location for a vast number of existing resources. So first we'll talk about the comprehensive resource library. We ended up with over 1,000 resources, 1,117 to be exact, in a spreadsheet library. Our review process resulted in 2 team members conducting digital research to identify applicable resources. This took about 3 months of our summer work. We looked at over 130 organizations and hubs in the US and Canada, and that includes federal, state, and provincial agencies, local governments, nonprofits, think tanks, academic institutions, consulting firms, and planning agencies. And this included reviewing websites, toolkits, documents, and existing resource libraries to collect relevant info. And a bit overview of what we looked at. We gathered webinars, fact sheets, clearinghouses, newsletters, maps, data, reports, planning guides, trainings, and toolkits. And each resource was cataloged and characterized using 22 attributes. For objective information, we incorporated the name, organization, language, access instructions, date created and updated, and the topic addressed. And we additionally analyzed and included in the spreadsheet for time required to use or digest the information of the resource, the reading level, accessibility, whether or not that required payment or membership, and the resource's consideration of relevant topics, and that included climate change and social equity. And so a quick analysis of what we looked at. We had over 32 topics covered, and these mostly focused on adaptation planning, flooding, and high water levels. The content type was about 65% of resources being text-based. Most were delivered using websites, reports, or fact sheets, and we found that very few audio or photo-based resources, such as podcasts or infographic, were available. For equity, 78% do not consider racial and social equity at all. Of the 21.8% that do, 25% of that 21.8% are not specific on what equity concern is considered. So that could be them briefly mentioning its existence, but not what to do about it. And NGOs and communities of practice particularly were successful at integrating equity in their resources. Onto geography, 44% of the Great Lakes Basin, 44% of the resources covered the Great Lakes Basin in some form. 35% of resources were United States focused, and only about 8% were Canadian specific. At a more granular level, Wisconsin and Michigan were the states most frequently targeted, and the St. Lawrence River is rarely mentioned in resources and resulted in only about 1.1% of our library particularly mentioning the St. Lawrence. When it comes to resource creators, 35% were created by federal agencies. This was followed by state and provincial organizations at 19% and collaboratives with 17%. The target audience, 70% had an explicit or implied target audience. Municipal staff and elected officials were the most common, but 26% of the resources were geared towards municipal or coastal planners as well. And only 2% were focused on engineers. Our readability, 41% were categorized as simple readability, 50% for moderate, and 9% required specialized knowledge. And this suggests that over 90% of the library could be understood by users with at least some college education. Time investment was about average of 1.3 hours to fully digest and read any of our resources. The primary language was available in English at 93.8%, very few were available in French. And finally, with accessibility, 98% of the majority of the library is only available in a single delivery or access form. 6% have some sort of access restriction. Again, could be payment, membership, a required login, maybe even a specific position that you need to hold. And then formal evaluation of usability of these resources is pretty uncommon. And so we'll move back next on to our recommended resource library. We developed this library and it was aimed at being a more useful, manageable, and external facing resource for municipalities and coastal resilience implementers. In distilling the comprehensive library down to a recommended resource library, we used a suite of evaluation criteria, and those are included here: usability, quality, and relevance. For usability, was it easily accessible to users? We prioritized those with no paywalls or other barriers to access. And if they used various mediums, so text, visuals, and different designs to organize information. For quality, was it produced by reputable organizations or authors? Do they have a history of excellency in this topic of interest? And then relevance, how applicable are they to recent coastal resilience issues? Do they have a current publication date? Do they update them often? Integrate recent information and data? And the recommended resources are either applicable to a wide range of potential users, but we did put a little bit more focus on Great Lakes and St. Lawrence Basin specific ones. A brief analysis of this library. In total, this library contains 188 recommended resources, which is 16.8% of the original library. It is organized into 11 topics, such as high water levels, flooding, erosion, green infrastructure, and infrastructure damage. These were identified with our clients and through interviews on the topics most interesting to our potential users. Next is our funding library and analysis, and this is still supporting Objective 1 with this library. Our goal was to analyze and assess existing gaps and needs in funding opportunities. So where do municipalities need more support in the grant procurement process particularly? And to list emerging and existing funding sources for coastal resilience work in US and Canada. And the resulting deliverable was a library of funding opportunities, and the goal specifically for this library was to provide communities with a cohesive location for the most reliably and regularly available funding opportunities to support the design, construction, and implementation of coastal resilience projects and initiatives. So the funding library, it resulted in 130 funding opportunities that were compiled. This was completed through digital research as well, on the web, and participation in virtual trainings and webinars. This library is highly selective, not comprehensive like the resource counterpart. Our team member emphasized current opportunities from 2019 to 2021 fiscal years, and most up-to-date information when the library was compiled, which was primarily in 2021. This library is limited as funding priorities and application processes regularly change, but this is mitigated through prioritizing well-established programs that routinely offer funding that were included in the compilation. And the research on funding looked particularly at the US, but Canadian resources were also analyzed. And a quick overview of what is included. Each resource was cataloged cataloged and characterized using 45 attributes. And those that are similar to the resource library include the geographic region covered, the topic or problem addressed, and time investment required to apply for funding. Others specific to the library are funding type, application requirements, project lifespan, total appropriated funds, match requirements, and eligibility description. In an analysis of this library, no qualitative analysis was conducted because the approach was more selective. We did conduct a qualitative analysis on practical information and tools, such as information on point of contacts, application requirements, database URLs, trainings, and pilot projects. And then some of the findings are listed here. So the term resilience is not widely used, particularly when advertising grants. It is also not yet widespread in the wider funding ecosystem. Funding availability also varies by where you are located. There exists massive state and provincial discrepancies based on politics and state taxes. Federally, most funding for coastal resilience in the US comes from the Great Lakes Restoration Initiative, or better known as GLRI. And the Federal Emergency Management Agency, or FEMA, can play a role, but there are challenges in accessing its funding, and FEMA is known to have structural inequalities and oversights. These programs need updating and as a result have low enrollment or interest from the communities we interviewed. And FEMA itself acknowledges its shortcomings. And there are funding alternatives, an example being environmental impact bonds. They are not a replacement for base funding from federal and state agencies, but can be an alternative option that is not yet well known or utilized. Next is that partnerships and relationships are key. Working with partner organizations, so nonprofits, conservation authorities in Canada, or planning agencies can ease grant administration burden. In Ontario, conservation authorities provide both technical and project administrative support. And stewarding relationships through the fundraising process is really important. This can provide access to insider information that improves chances of success. Funding is also an ongoing process and the cycles are ever changing, which was evident both in the review that our fellow team member did on finding the funding and attempting to make the resource useful, but also the difficulty resulting for any municipalities looking to get funding. Finally, the Infrastructure Investment and Jobs Bill will provide a huge influx of funding in the next few years. $6 billion is anticipated for coastal resilience work, which can be a huge opportunity for the Great Lakes region. And next, Annika will be discussing our interview processes.
Thanks so much, Anna. So Anna just covered our data collection and results that went towards Objective 1. I'm now going to dive into Objective 2 as a reminder, which is to identify enabling and constraining factors of local coastal resilience work in the Great Lakes and St. Lawrence River Basin. So a large portion of our work and data collection was spent interviewing stakeholders across the basin. The goal of this and these interviews and the analysis that followed was to analyze and assess existing gaps and needs. And then the outcome of that, that all went into fulfilling Objective 3 in those recommendations. Our interviews were categorized by resource providers and implementation interviews. So resource providers are organizations that provide educational materials and technical support, some of which can be found in the library that Anna discussed earlier. So this can include state and federal agencies, nonprofits, boundary organizations, academic institutions, collaboratives, and partnerships between any of these kinds of organizations. On the flip side, implementation interviews were municipal practitioners that utilized resources in their applied coastal resilience work. And these interviewees include mayors, community planners, port authorities, and directors or staff in various relevant departments. But neither of these lists are completely exhaustive. Next slide, please. So first, to dive into our resource provider interviews. We conducted interviews with 18 different staff members from 16 organizations and agencies representing state, provincial, and federal agencies, collaboratives, boundary organizations, nonprofits, and academic institutions, some of which are represented here. We also conducted 2 focus groups one with the state coastal zone management programs, and then another one with the state sea grants programs. And those two focus groups combined, we spoke to about 30 people. And in the individual interviews process, we gained the perspective of 2 Canadian organizations and 1 Indigenous commission. When speaking with providers, we had a few questions in mind. So what are their perceptions of existing efforts, resources, gaps, and needs in the coastal resilience space? How are they supporting municipalities? How effective do they feel their efforts are? And what is or is not working? Next slide, please. So, flip side, our implementation interviews, we spoke to 44 different people across 41 municipalities, and they're all represented here on this map of the watershed. As you can see, we had majority of our representation was from Michigan and Wisconsin, and then also from Lake Superior and Lake Michigan. This makes sense as Wisconsin and Michigan have incredibly long shorelines in the Great Lakes, and our interviews overall leaned more towards the United States, although we did speak to several Canadian municipalities. We were only able to speak with one person working for a tribal government, so we consider them deeply underrepresented in our data collection. And then we also consider New York and Quebec underrepresented in our data collection. That being said, we were able to speak with people from every state and province, and we also got representation from every lake, plus Lake St. Clair and the St. Lawrence River. So a broad geographic spread that's a little thin in some areas, but we were able to speak to lots of different people around the basin. Next slide, please. So our interview questions drew from a Coastal Resilience Needs Assessment Survey that was conducted by our client, the Cities Initiative, and the University of Illinois Urbana-Champaign. That was conducted prior to our project starting and kind of lay the foundation of where we wanted to go. So some key themes that we pulled out of that we knew we wanted to touch on were impacts and response, the use of funding and financing, what resources people were using, how outside information was being communicated, how networks were being built, what long-term planning looked like, how equity is incorporated, and what success looks like. And the interviews were organized into these 3 big beats or structures. So what's the relationship like with resource providing agencies, the state of their current coastal work, and then for them, what does coastal resilience look like in the future, and how will they get there? Which is question number 3 was a really big part of understanding the enabling and constraining factors, because it's one thing to kind of understand what's challenging them today. It's very easy sometimes to see what's challenging people today, but it's a lot harder to figure out what's going to challenge people tomorrow and into the future. Next slide, please. So a little bit of how we processed our interviews and focus group data. We ended up with 53 interviews and then 2 focus groups, so it was a lot of data to process. We coded the interviews and focus groups using Atlas TI software, and our coding goal was to categorize interview data, not to auto-analyze our data, as this program is commonly used for. And the guiding rationale behind this was to use our team's critical thinking as the centers of analysis, rather than just qualitative data analysis software alone. As Anna just detailed, there's a lot of other streams of research and data collection happening, a lot of other learning happening, and we felt that just using the qualitative data analysis software wouldn't capture or wouldn't enable us to connect all the various parts of our project effectively. So that's what we went with. And what you're seeing here is a representation of all our various codes and how frequently they were used. We have some codes for broad concerns like response or data and resources, and more tailored codes to specific agencies or bodies of water, or more specific solutions or problems. And as you can see, funding, response, relationships with other entities, data and resources were all commonly cited and referred to and talked about during our interviews, which shows that they are, and they were, common and critical concerns around the basin. That being said, some of the physically smaller codes were also just as important. Like public access is pretty small on this, but it was something that many municipalities were quite concerned about. So, next slide, please. So to dive into some of the findings from our interviews, we split them broadly into the 6 C's of community, confusion, control, capital, capacity, and connection. So to dive into community, public access, as I said, and safety were key concerns of municipal officials and were often cited as key components of their vision of long-term coastal resilience. Makes sense, they are public officials and they work to serve their communities. And while resident and municipal official attitudes towards climate change likely do influence the amount and kind of work done, we found that this wasn't necessarily an indicator of a municipality doing coastal work if an interviewee expressed climate skepticism or climate denial themselves or referred to it as an issue in their own community. That wasn't necessarily an indicator of work being done. Instead, we found that the most important factor within our interviewees in shaping coastal resilience response was to the extent to which a community was dealing with direct tangible impacts of climate change and coastal issues, and they were often crises, so regardless of their perceptions of climate science. Additionally, the timing of election cycles, grant cycles, as well as water cycles really impacted when work could be done, if people cared about it, just kind of needing, for the lack of a better term, a perfect storm of all of these things to coincide so you could get a project going, get funding, all of that. And particularly the water cycles was directly tied to residents' short-term memories of these impacts. So as the water fluctuated and went down, the urgency also decreased and they were less interested in putting their tax dollars towards projects because it was no longer a pressing issue. Next, in confusion, climate change and its impact on coastal communities can be difficult to interpret when you're in an agency, and especially when you're trying to do 10,000 other things. As a municipal official, understanding shoreline dynamics is a barrier to implementing effective coastal projects. And it's actually difficult for municipalities to turn to their go-to consulting or engineering firm because coastal projects and coastal engineering is often considered a niche area for most of those firms, and they might not have a coastal engineer on staff. So you're kind of starting from scratch and needing to look somewhere else for that expertise, which plays into another element of confusion of who do they need to contact? How do they start this work? Often municipal staff don't know who to turn to if they have a question on where to get started or on an application because it is a niche area or can be a niche area of municipal project and work. Towards control, we found that communities with greater proportion of public shoreline were able to more easily do work and implement larger scale projects instead of having to patchwork response if they owned kind of random segments along the shoreline, or if it was majority privately property owned shoreline, you have to be a little more creative to try and control people's behavior on the shoreline instead of just designing a project, getting funding and executing it. And therefore protecting private property was often left to the landowners themselves. There's very little public money for private property, we found. And then as well as planning documents could enable or restrict coastal work. So if your comprehensive plan includes coastal resilience and coastal projects in its work, it's easier to follow that momentum to implement some of those projects, or if it's in your capital improvement plan. But if it's not in those documents, it's a lot harder to get started and to build momentum and use those documents as justification for doing work. Speaking of capital improvement plans, the capital section mostly focus is on understanding how to best apply for grants and working within those cycles. And we also saw that match dollars and project-based funding were barriers for municipalities to do work. And capacity. Staff capacity and financial capacity are deeply tied together. Staff capacity in general is kind of easy to understand. When there is capacity, work can be done. When there's no capacity, work can't be done. But the issue is that there is not enough capacity anywhere across the basin at any level of government. So at the municipal level, at the county level, at the regional planning commission, at the state agency, at the federal level. Basically everyone, not basically everyone always, no one said I have enough staff to do what I want to do. And the way to expand staff capacity and technical capacity is directly tied back to dollars, either to hire more municipal staff, to hire a contractor, or to support more staff at the state and federal agency level. And finally, connection. There seems to be a missing link between resource providers and municipalities, which we dubbed the missing middleman, but there's just missing connective tissue between these levels of governments. We also saw the importance and benefits of working with nearby municipalities, as well as forming relationships with outside entities, as these relationships were often key to getting work done and learning about coastal work around the basin. So I'm now going to turn it back to Anna. We'll dive into the final section of our presentation.
Thank you, Annika. I'm going to be talking about takeaways and recommendations. First, takeaways, I will go over, kind of bring together our findings from the libraries as well as the interviews. So it's bringing it all together. On this first slide, we have the problem of reactiveness. There's a lack of understanding around around hard shoreline armoring, leading to this reactiveness and solutions that do not prioritize nature-based solutions. Basin municipalities need to emphasize a long-term and value-based approach for more sustainable outcomes. And municipalities are often prevented from making long-term plans due to short-term memories of residents. Next, silos exist across the basin, unsurprisingly considering its size and the many organizations that exist. There's little communication between municipalities, agencies, and other organizations for projects, resources, or funding. Many groups are working on the same things and are doing duplicative work. We heard from interviews just how many other agencies and organizations were doing similar work on resilience. And rather than repeating projects that use up time and funding, this capacity could be utilized elsewhere. There's not enough emphasis on sharing and at times even promoting territorial feelings about successful projects or programs, not unlike a lot of academia. For information overwhelm, as mentioned, we found over 1,000 resources, something that took 2 team members 3 months of full-time work to complete. And choosing the best resource that is most applicable, relevant, and usable can be difficult and takes time, hopefully not 3 months for these municipal leaders, and energy that many staff don't have. And then finally, we're going to talk about capacity again. It was evident that even well-intentioned staff struggled to have this time to sift through resources and apply for grants. Whether a municipality has 1 full-time staff member or a whole engineering team and planning departments, staff never felt like they had enough time to properly address resilience planning. And generally, there isn't capacity anywhere at any level of government. From this slide, the missing middleman, Annika already mentioned it a little bit ago. The missing middleman person was immediately evident in our interviews as being important yet lacking in the basin. The role of this person may be just as important as the physical and engineering solutions to coastal hazards because they can connect resource providers and funders with the municipalities that are trying to do the work. And again, this may reduce duplicative projects and resources. For funding, having a grant writer on staff particularly increase the ability of a municipality to have successful grant applications. They can identify your community's sweet spot, which can include finding a manageable award amount, relevant project type, and alignment with goals and needs. They reduced the effort of applying to multiple grants and focused on the ones that they'd be most likely successful at. Relationships matter. This can be intermunicipal relationships like sharing knowledge between staff, or it can be working with nearby municipalities with shared shoreline to split the cost of a project. Additionally, fostering relationships with agency staff increase successful project planning and implementation. This closely connects with the need for a middle person to maintain relationships, and the role can provide suggestions for the best available resources or the organizations that are most helpful in completing a desired project. And then equity. There is an obvious equity disconnect. Interviewees could identify those who are most vulnerable in a community. People unable to access the beach or the existence of socioeconomic concerns were pretty common, but they didn't immediately see it as an equity problem. Equity in the minds of many interviewees centered around racial equity and not its many other facets. And finally, I'll be going over the recommendations that we created as part of the project. These are based on the outcomes of Objective 1 and 2, which are the libraries and interviews we have already gone over. And so we developed these recommendations to satisfy Objective 3. And as a reminder, Objective 3 is to recommend strategies for effective and collaborative coastal resilience work. Along the top in the dark blue boxes, you will find the primary challenges, which I just mentioned as part of our takeaways. And below in the gray boxes, you will find a few key recommendations aimed at tackling that challenge. So the first challenge is the short-term thinking and the reactive paradigm. Towards solving this, municipalities must embody the long-term view on coastal resilience despite changes in politics and water levels. That includes conducting a long-term coastal planning and monitoring, identifying and prioritizing potential coastal projects, including those projects in capital improvement plans as well, and developing shovel-ready designs. Challenge 2 is the presence of siloed information and expertise. We recommend all stakeholders more actively work to cultivate binational, basin-wide communication, relationship building, and information sharing. To meet this, stakeholders should proactively foster relationships and establish lines of communication before urgent situations arise. Establish a designated staff person at a resource provider organization to serve as that missing middle person. That person could be the conduit or liaison between municipalities and other organizations or levels of government. And lastly, this recommendation includes holding a regular sub-basin or basin-wide summit or conference to synergize efforts, share successes, and challenges. The third challenge is information overwhelm. We recommend resource providers identify a primary hub for coastal resilience resources and build the capacity of existing sub-hubs. We propose resource providers identify one organization to host, manage, and update a centralized resources hub, and improve usability and searchability of other hubs. Consult with target users during resource development and evaluation, and conduct social research to understand current and potential use of resources and hubs. On this slide, challenge 4 and the problem of confusion, we recommend educating coastal communities about coastal and climate processes and potential resilient solutions. For municipalities, that means engaging residents in coastal planning to ensure solutions are relevant and supported by the public. For resource providers, that means establishing a grassroots stewardship program to cultivate local champions and maintain momentum towards coastal resilience on all properties, both private and public. Challenges 5 and 6 center around the lack of capacity and barriers to funding. We have a few recommendations that cover both, so we've combined them here for simplicity. Our recommendations include investing in regional scale grant writing support and technical expertise to support municipalities, ensuring resource providers are accessible go-to experts on finding funds and launching projects, identifying potential local partners to ease the burden of project administration, and removing structural barriers to improve accessibility to funding and financing. That means more heavily weighting applicants for disadvantaged communities or applications that integrate equity, widening grant eligibility, and removing match and other cost sharing requirements for disadvantaged communities. And our final recommendation and challenge relates to the integration of equity considerations in coastal resilience work more generally. We suggest all resource providers embody a basin-wide view and think beyond their organization's geographic scope or membership when developing resources. Considering the Canadian perspective and seeking feedback from Canadian stakeholders is important here as well. Increasing French translation of resources to ensure Quebec stakeholders can access information. Making resources available in different delivery formats to promote universal access. For municipalities, we recommend consulting with tribes and other marginalized groups early and often when developing projects. And that includes allocating time to listen, learn, and build relationships with these groups. Integrating consideration of traditional ecological knowledge into project ideation is also important. And I will now be passing it back to Annika to wrap up the remainder of the presentation.
So if any or all of that sounded interesting to you, here's where you can get more information. Our full-length report is now available. That is the beautiful front cover of it on the left. The DOI is listed on the next slide. We are in the process of finalizing a shorter user-facing report geared towards municipalities, and that should be available in the next couple weeks. And we are currently working through finding a permanent home for the resources and funding libraries. That being said, we are more than happy to share them with anyone who's interested. Please let us know if you were interested in having any or all of these, because we would like to share it with anyone who's interested. Next slide, please. So thank you all so much for your time today. We really appreciated being here. Thank you again to NOAA Central Libraries for having us. Thank you to Becky for introducing us. I'm Annika Tomson, along with Annika Kaczmarek. Those are our 2 emails, and then the report DOI is listed right there as well, if you would like to go look it up and check it out. And we are more than happy to answer any questions that you may have.
Great, thank you so much. Both questions that have come in so far are, where can we find the resource and funding libraries, and where can we find this report? So I have put the reports link into the chat, so I hope everyone can click and follow through on that. But just to confirm, if they do want these funding libraries or the resource libraries, just email you guys?
Yes.
Awesome. Okay, I do have one question here. If there's one thing you'd like to make sure the audience walks away with, what would it be?
I can answer that question first. I would say that Anna said it earlier in the presentation, but that connective tissue between municipalities and resource providing agencies is a major barrier when it's not there, but it's also a massive help, or it overcomes a lot of other challenges and barriers that we identify when it does exist. You don't really have information overwhelm where you can get a direct recommendation from either another municipality that's been doing that project but is a little farther along than you, or you have a direct contact with, say, your Sea Grant program who can direct you to the right place. It becomes a lot less overwhelming when that connective tissue is in place. And we really saw that it was equally as important, if I'm not going to say more important, because I think I would just be biased in saying that, but relationships are really key to making coastal resilience work. It's not just having the most engineered and perfect solution to your situation. You also need the relationships around that project to support that work.
I can just add a quick little side. I absolutely agree with what Annika said, and I think that would be a primary one for me. But I guess as more of a side for the resource collection side, I and my fellow team members were working on the collection of all those resources. And not only will relationships help with reducing duplicative efforts, but also just finding resources or contact for people to get those resources was incredibly difficult. We came across so many 404 pages, resources that weren't updated or inaccurate. I followed up with a few organizations that had links that would go to websites that I thought that might be giving me a virus. It's very simple, but maintaining what you do create also is pretty important. And I know that's a huge problem with capacity, is that you want to create more resources rather than maintaining what you already have. But as a follow-up to the relationship building is also prioritizing what you have already done.
Great, thank you both. Okay, moving on to the questions that have come in. Can you provide an example of duplicative efforts that you found?
Yeah, actually, with our own research, we chatted with or interviewed a couple different people on Lake Michigan who referenced, the details aren't fresh in my head anymore because it was about 8 months ago, but they referenced that the Army Corps was doing like a similar assessment of the state of coastal resilience work. And there is another reference that I cannot remember, but I know there's an Army Corps project and there was like another thing happening where a lot of people seem to be trying to do similar work to what we were doing, which wasn't that great to hear in the middle of data collection, but it was, too late on that front. But, our own work was duplicative. So that's an example.
As also for municipalities, if they're doing the same project very close on the shoreline, I think it was already mentioned in our project presentation, but if you want to also share your funding, so rather than doing a project along the same shoreline near each other separately, it could be combined. That's also more of a municipal level example.
Great, thank you. So next question. You mentioned that equity in minds of interviewees centered on racial equity, not its other many facets, which is very interesting. I feel like people default to this for lack of a better idea. Across the basin, what measures available through EJ Screen, for example, would best pinpoint the most vulnerable communities?
I'm not sure there was a good one, truly. That wasn't a focus of our work necessarily, so I think that what we say isn't necessarily going to be the most helpful, but yeah, identifying, I think that's something that's also a lot of work that we know going on at our own school, is trying to understand and identify those type of communities. We were looking more at a municipal level of like, rather than from the resource provider side, because they had a better understanding of including that in their resources. I don't know if Annika has a better.
Yeah, I would say from the municipality side, a lot of if we're, I don't know, income levels, size of like the house or like the structure relative to the like lot size or like how big the actual property is, because that can actually impact how much water is able to be absorbed during flooding, and also can be a shorthand for how recently a property was built, because a lot of the newer construction tends to take up more of the lot size, which makes it more difficult for rain and stormwater to be absorbed. Could also mean they're built higher and it like pushes water onto other communities. But I don't know if that's necessarily, I'm not familiar with all the metrics in EJ Screen, so I don't know if that's going to be a metric, but that might be that would be a shorthand at getting at, I think, at least some of the complicated issues of equity on shorelines, because a lot of those coastal properties, not all of them, but a lot of them, are second homes, are retirement homes, for people who have the financial capacity on some level to adapt, but it's not ubiquitous. There are people who have inherited those cottages. And there's also the issue of municipalities being able to support the private property infrastructure. So this is a great way of saying it's complicated, and we're not certain that there's one metric or even 3 metrics that could perfectly capture it.
Thank you so much for your answers. The asker wants to tell you that was an excellent answer for a tough question. So Our next question is a little similar to ones we've talked about duplication, but given that so many challenges like lake level are by lake rather than by country, we're talking US and Canada, are there opportunities to remove duplication of efforts across Canada and the US within the same lake?
I would say yes. I understand the difficulties relating to binational collaboration. I don't even think it needs to be necessarily across a single lake. There's a lot of, I guess, duplication can mean a lot, and successes and challenges can be across a lot of different lakes. So collaborating with Canada is would be excellent. I think a lot of our interviews with Canada, they seem to have a little bit better focus on prioritizing projects for their resource providers, particularly their federal and state organizations, rather than these resources that might be created like a fact sheet. And I think that is an excellent area that the US could particularly look at. But yes, collaboration between the two would be excellent.
All right, I think I'm going to wrap up with this question. Were you impressed by an action or some actions taken, actions a particular municipality was taking, and could you talk about that briefly?
Yes. There are many examples of really phenomenal municipalities and people doing truly like incredible creative work and doing a lot with not a lot of money or not a lot of staff capacity. But we only came across one instance of public monies coming together to support private property resilience work in Ohio. I'm going to get I think it's 13 different communities came together to support, obtain grant money, and then they were distributing it out to private property shoreline residents in order to install shoreline resilience efforts. So it was a great example of many different communities deciding as a region to prioritize that work and collaborating together. And that was the only time we came across public monies being kind of directly used to protect private shoreline and private property. So that would be my example of someone that stood out.
Anna, do you have an example that you want to share?
I did not do as many municipal side interviews and research. I was looking more on the resource provider side. I guess I could provide a good example. NOAA Digital Coast, unsurprisingly, is pretty excellent with things like this. And from the Canadian side, the conservation authorities at a more local level did an excellent job at being the ones to initiate conversations with local municipalities and being very attentive with technical support and project level assistance. So I know that wasn't, you had asked about municipal, but
No, that's okay. Well, I want to thank everyone for joining us. I want to thank our speakers so much for presenting on this. As a native Michigander, I was very excited to hear what's going on. And we did have some lovely comments here about, this is a great presentation. Having a centralized place for all these links is a fantastic idea, and it's going to really benefit a lot of communities. And then a comment from the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers that they will also be building on your work. So I want to thank everyone for joining us. Thank you again to the speakers. If you want to share this, it'll be up on the library's YouTube. And with that, I hope everyone has a safe and healthy rest of their Tuesday. Thank you all.